Hi, Tim. Good morning. Thank you for joining me here today. I know we have a lot of important stuff to talk about, but before we jump into the question part of it, I would love if you would just introduce yourself, give a little background, so that everyone listening knows who you are.
Thanks, Lauren. Good morning and delighted to be with you and the community. My name is Tim Franson. I'm a physician and pharmacist by training. Have worked in infectious diseases in the industry for over 20 years and have had the pleasure of now consulting for PPMD through what's now Faegre Drinker for over a dozen years. So delighted to be able to add to the community's discussions on this topic.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And it sure is an exciting time in the Duchenne muscular dystrophy community with the recent AdCom announcement coming out just this morning. We heard news that it's going to be on May 12th. We're really excited and we're thrilled that you're here to give us some background on everything. So let's jump into it. So the first question I have for you is, why is an AdCom held? What is an AdCom? Why is it held?
Great. Well, that's a wonderful place to start. And we are using kind of abbreviated speech. Advisory committees are often referred to as AdComs within and outside the FDA. And FDA usually brings together expert review committees on a periodic basis. They do this for a variety of reasons, although they retain the formal decision making within the FDA groups. But they often ask external bodies, physicians, advocates, and others to gather specifically to talk about specific products under consideration for approval processes, and on occasion other things such as policy matters. So these meetings are announced to the public at a minimum of 15 calendar days prior to the meeting, and it's always published in the FDA's Federal Register notices, as well as on their advisory committee website.
That's great and really helpful. So what is an AdCom? And thank you for flagging that AdCom is advisory committee meeting. I think I'm already stuck in the lingo, but what is an AdCom and what is its importance and purpose?
Well, those are very good questions. And the importance and purpose is that they bring to the FDA independent advice to help shore up the credibility of any decisions to be made. So they've been open, transparent, and had the opportunity to have a public airing of any issues. So that's certainly the importance factor. But what it is, FDA probably has close to 50 advisory committees across their many centers. They frequently are constituted as standing committees, but are convened in person or virtually only when there are specific issues before them, such as approval discussions and so forth. Those who are on advisory committees are selected by invitation and application. You can apply to be an advisory committee member. Credentials that are requested and are published by them. These are usually focused on a particular therapy area, for example, as in central nervous system and peripheral nervous system advisory committees. There are also some that span the broader FDA network, such as benefit risk advisory committees, which are not compound specific or disease specific. So the number of committees is determined by each center. Without going through that, the center we're talking about now is the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, or CBER, and that important organization has a number of advisory committees. The one we'll be addressing here, of course, is the Cell and Gene Therapy Advisory Committee, which will be looking at the application from Sarepta for gene therapy for Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And with all sorts of advisory committees and so forth, There's a specific remit. They have a charter. They have a number of advanced plans that are dictated by the administration at FDA. And when an advisory committee is deemed to be called, and they're called on the judgment of the specific FDA group, the division which is reviewing an application, for example, then the convening of that advisory committee occurs, and it has a kind of set format and also set membership, which can be supplemented.
Great. So we've talked a little bit about the background of an AdCom and why it's important and why it happens, but who serves on an AdCom?
Well, with advisory committees, they are constituted by FDA, but the membership is entirely non-FDA individuals. There are standing committee members who are appointed usually for a several-year term, and they are standing at the ready, if you will, when meetings are called. They may include several constituencies, which are very important to the review of, in this case, applications. The first group there is scientists, clinical scientists, laboratory scientists, chemistry and manufacturing experts, and so forth from within the broader disciplines in academia or practice settings. And those folks have technical expertise that bear on the clinical and chemistry aspects, for example, of an application. A second very important constituency are patient delegates, and there is a formal patient representative on all of these advisory committees. Third, there is a non-voting industry representative who provides perspective on typical best practices for development and so forth. In addition to standing members, so those are the main constituencies there, depending on what therapeutic area and particular compound is going to be reviewed, the FDA can stipulate additional special government employees who are invited to add particular expertise on an application. It may be, in this case, on gene therapy. It may be individuals who have deep expertise in statistics or other things that bear directly on the questions FDA creates for the advisory committee to form. In addition, FDA leadership and their staff are present and provide presentation materials and commentary when they are not voting members, and the deliberations are entirely exercised by those appointed committee members.
Okay, that's great. So what information will the community receive about the AdCom prior to it happening, and where is it usually posted?
Well, first, I'll go to the last question, which is where are things posted? And there's an FDA Advisory Committee website for each center, like Center for Drugs, Center for Biologics, the latter of which we're concerned about for today's discussion. And those are typically updated, as I mentioned before, a minimum of 15 days prior to a committee. But actually, there are additional materials posted within 48 hours of the committee meeting. And those are the kinds of materials that the actual committee members receive through FDA and sponsor companies. Those are called briefings. And if you will, they are the case for approval by the sponsor and the case for review and concerns by the FDA. They can be quite substantial documents electronically or if you print them out. And those are very important because they go through a set order of concerns from clinical safety, clinical efficacy, or how well the compound works, how the compound is manufactured, what its quality standards were, and so forth, each of which may be particular separate scientific discussion as part of the advisory committee. And those packages are available in totality for review by the community, by patient advocates, by families, by investment community, or whomever might have an interest in the proceedings that are about to occur. In addition, the advisory committee members and special receive all these things prior to the public release of that information to give those experts an adequate amount of time to carefully consider the information being presented and pro and con what may be discussed. And there will be specific questions prepared by the FDA for the advisory committee members, which usually involve framing of questions about the information presented. And a question, for example, might be based on the information that's been presented in the sponsor. Do the committee members feel that the information presented is sufficient to warrant approval based on the benefits of the compound outweighing the potential risks? And that would be one example. Frequently, there may be separate questions about the clinical effectiveness and perhaps some domains under that, particular considerations or variations in age of patients, gender, and so forth, that may be important considerations for FDA when they think about how to label a product for practitioners to be able to be used after approval.
That's great. So is this typical or limited to the accelerated approval pathway?
Well, FDA has the authority to call advisory committees for any indication in any compound. It's not limited to accelerated approval. And we can get into the difference in a standard for approval based on the accelerated pathway versus the traditional pathway. And those standards are very important because they're the yardsticks against which FDA has to measure whether the evidence has exceeded the burden of proof for effectiveness, for safety, and so forth. And the discussions of those things, I should probably just address the standards. For a traditional approval, usually based on endpoints which may be irreversible morbidity and mortality. In other words, symptoms and signs that don't revert back to normal with treatment, or, God forbid, mortality, the passing away of patients. And those are very important. FDA and sponsors agree in advance what is to be measured for how patients feel, function, and survive. And that is usually the pathway to full approval based on traditionally 2 adequate and well-controlled trials. And adequate and well-controlled means that the construct of a trial assures minimization of bias, appropriate capture of information that will allow FDA and any listeners to be able to carefully sort through the information and decide if there is that effect is sufficient to exceed what other approved drugs may be, or in the case of areas like Duchenne, where there are significant unmet medical needs still, although there are approved compounds, and what those particular effects may be seen by careful reviewers as proven.
That's great.
So that's traditional. You probably want me to talk about accelerated too.
That would be great. Yes, thank you.
Sorry, I kind of took a deep breath and took a bit of a breath break. But when we talk about the difference of accelerated approval, typically studies are done for accelerated approval with different endpoints than traditional. The reason being that sometime with a chronic progressive disease like Duchenne muscular dystrophy, one doesn't necessarily see all those endpoints of irreversibility and mortality in reasonable time to do a trial. So you need some other milestone short of irreversible science.
Okay.
And that may be one of two things. It may be a biomarker that has been shown to be associated with progression of disease, some kind of blood test or x-ray test, others that have been shown to be reliable in predicting the course of disease would otherwise continue without these interventions that are being presented for consideration of approval. That's one. And the other is what are termed intermediate clinical endpoints. And those are things that are known to be on the natural history, the pathway to the progression of a given disease. So loss of ambulation of upper or lower extremities in the case of Duchenne. And are there particular predictors, normal exercise studies that would indicate that ambulation is likely to be lost in a predictable period of time? Those kind of biomarkers or intermediate clinical endpoints may serve as the evidence for an accelerated approval. And when one gets an accelerated approval, it comes with a specific commitment to be able to show post-approval, post-accelerated approval, that there is an effect onward to irreversible morbidity and mortality. So that means confirmatory studies need to be done, and therefore it is kind of a conditional approval that the company is required to, and FDA is responsible for the review of that confirmatory information to be able to assert over the longer term that the drug works as it appears to.
No, that's really helpful. You kind of touched on this a little bit, but could you answer if our AdComs scheduled for every accelerated approval, AA approval? And so like when and why are they scheduled? So why are we doing one?
Yes, you did skip, or I did skip over your prior query, so allow me to come back to that. And not every accelerated approval has an advisory committee, and not every advisory committee is about accelerated approvals. Usually the criteria that FDA has used in terms of providing an advisory committee is when there is something new, unprecedented, and certainly gene therapies are new to the scene. When something has particular characteristics that have led to differing interpretations by FDA and companies. And it's important, therefore, to get a broader scientific discussion of the pros and cons of those concerns, be it safety, effectiveness, manufacturing issues, and so forth. When things have potentially high risk, that is, that when something has therapeutic effect and also high risk, what is that balance of benefit and risk? And how do you juxtapose those? And are there interventions or advisory committee members or others might be able to recommend as risk mitigations to be able to help predictably manage what could be complications of therapy? So that's frequently an opportunity for a discussion. And if there are particular unprecedented issues related to procedures or so forth that FDA feels it's important to have aired in a public setting. So all those things, whether it's an accelerated or traditional approval, are important discussion factors that usually dictate an advisory committee being held.
No, that's really helpful. And thank you for the background. So we got into a little bit about the composition of the committee, but Is there a special committee appointed by the FDA, and what is the composition of the committee?
Well, the Cell and Gene Therapy Advisory Committee has a standing membership, and there are members who are physicians and clinicians who work in the area of gene therapy, as well as usually in a much broader frame. In this case, you may see neurological experts and so forth. You see basic preclinical scientists who have uh, considerable expertise in the development of gene therapies and their manufacture and the kinds of things that relate to how gene therapies are delivered with viral vectors, for example, the kind of carrier molecules. The gene is the gunpowder inside the vectors or the bullets that are injected into the patients with the intent to find the right sites, in this case in muscle, heart muscle, skeletal muscle, otherwise, to be able to incorporate the genes that are missing and to be able to then see the clinical benefit. So there are about a dozen standing committee members, which include patient representatives and industry representatives. And then we can anticipate, as we watch for further announcements for this upcoming committee, that we'll see some special government invitees who presumably would have more expertise with Duchenne gene therapy and so forth. There are certainly a number of important academic medical centers that deal deeply within the gene therapy disciplines. So we would anticipate that would be the case, and that we will see pending announcements of additions to the standing membership.
Thank you. That's really helpful. So we've talked a little bit about this too, but would you mind explaining the process of how an AdCom works?
Certainly, and that's very important. We always want to be sure that there's procedural integrity in these things for the benefit of the public, the patients, and those involved in the actual processes. So, as already mentioned, there are briefing documents and usually an exchange of ideas and information between FDA and the sponsor. The advisory committee is usually convened after a submission has been brought to the FDA by the sponsor company, but before the final decision has been made as to approval or whether instead additional studies are required. So that information has been exchanged. There's an opportunity for FDA and the companies to discuss what kind of questions should be raised to the advisory committee. And usually there is an exchange of how those might be framed and what priority order might be provided to them. It is FDA's final decision authority how those questions are framed and put forward and will be discussed. In addition, those briefing documents, kind of the culmination of everything work that has been done in many patients, in many laboratories, and so forth, that summarizes the totality of evidence about a given application, about what has been done clinically and wise and so forth for the submission material. And that then is provided in advance along with the questions that will be posed to the committee. And when the committee is convened, there's a set of standard steps. FDA usually opens the committee meetings with a series of administrative details, and they're important. They talk about the importance of disclosing any conflicts of interest by any and all speakers that may come forward. Then usually there is a presentation either by the FDA or by the sponsor group first. Usually there are 5 to 6 speakers for each of those domains. If FDA goes first, for example, there will be introductory comments, usually by the administrative leader of division or office of FDA responsible for the review. Then there will be preclinical presentations, clinical presentations, sometimes separately about effectiveness and safety, and then any questions about chemistry, manufacturing. That's something that's always of interest as gene therapy evolves in this case. And then usually summary comments. And that would then be followed, by example, by company experts. There would be an administrative leader who may offer introductory comments, kind of a summary. And then clinical speakers, safety and effectiveness. There may be key opinion leaders who have been investigators for the studies or who have consulted for either FDA or the industry company on any particular technical aspects. Then there would be, after each of those groups have spoken, the opportunity for the standing committee members and special government employees who are there to ask clarifying questions of each of those constituencies. So after FDA presents, the committee, the advisory committee or AdCom has the opportunity to ask questions of a clarifying nature for those who have presented. And of course, after the other constituency, the sponsor committee has completed their presentations, questions will be held. Then there is usually, and sometimes there's an administrative break for biological imperatives or lunch. One of them is what's termed the open public hearing. This is an opportunity for interested parties, those involved in the advocacy community, parents, patients, those who may have done independent studies with other academic centers who wish to add their perspectives on matters. And those typically occur in the open public hearing by a set time for each speaker to provide their commentary. That's often difficult for many of us to condense what may be years of concerns or studies into a 3, 4, or 5-minute presentation. And fortunately, there are usually submitted written comments, which have then allowed the FDA to reflect further on those commentaries that are presented in brief at the open public hearing. At the end of the open public hearing, the committee then goes into their open discussion. Sometimes there are additional clarifying questions. More frequently, the committee then begins to undertake a direct discussion of the questions posed by FDA. So the committee chair, again, that's a party external to government and part of the standing advisory committee, will bring the particular question forward to the committee and ask each committee member to opine, discuss on the question how they have heard the information, whether they have any lingering concerns, questions, strong opinions related to their clinical disciplinary experience, for example. And then at the conclusion of each questioning discussion, the advisory committee chair usually calls for a vote by the committee members of whether they agree or disagree that the burden of evidence has been met for the effectiveness of the compound being convincing, for example. And frequently we'll say, please vote yes, no, or abstain. And please clarify very briefly what the basis for your final decision was. And then they might move to question 2 about safety with a similar format. And then at the conclusion of the questions being discussed, and sometimes they will ask FDA members to speak to that, those not only in the review areas, but maybe in upper administration who frequently sit in these meetings, that then the committee proceedings will have concluded. And FDA usually thanks the committee members for their input. And a typical comment at that point in time is, while the votes are helpful, what FDA really values as part of their decision-making process for their final deliberation is the quality of the discussion and the particular matters being brought forward. So not just the votes, but the content behind those votes. So that's, with apologies, a very windy description to the sequence of that.
No, that's really helpful. And I know I appreciate the background. I'm sure those listening will too. So in the open public hearing portion, who is allowed to present? People who participate in clinical trials, people interested in taking the drug or biologic. Are all these individuals expected to be supportive of the approval? So what's the deal there?
Well, that's a great segue into the important word in open public hearing, which is open. That anyone with any opinion, pro or con, has the opportunity to apply to be able to speak. And usually that application to speak includes asking what the intended commentary may be. That does, and so pro or con does not flavor whether that party may be accepted. Uh, Frequently, the FDA looks to a range of commentators, so it adds to the transparency of the overall process. Now, obviously, on areas where there is considerable interest, one can't hold a 6-hour open public hearing. Otherwise, we'd be having to get sleeping bags for the committee members for their all-nighter and in their considerations. So finding those who can comment and provide representative views, pro and con, are very important. Certainly, one would anticipate that advocacy groups, that patients, especially those who had participated in trials, that those who had been involved in investigations might be very important to hear. There are also other committees beyond FDA who frequently participate in advisory committees who are public interest groups and so forth that frequently add their comments about effectiveness, safety, and so forth. So one can expect a wide range of speakers, and it would be hard to predict what those might be because of the openness. And again, we're privileged to be able to have that kind of transparency to add to the fullness of the scientific and in principle discussions.
No, that's helpful. So will the FDA ask questions of the advisory committee? I know you touched on this already. Will the advisory committee be expected to vote about the approval? And does the opinion of the advisory committee sway the FDA's decision?
Well, those are all important points. FDA poses their questions in writing in advance. It does not insist, but usually expects some kind of up-down voting by members, but more importantly, why they voted up or down on the questions posed. FDA certainly calls for these special advisory committee meetings because they want and value that external scientific expertise. It gives sometimes refreshing views. But the question of whether it may sway whether the advisory committee would sway the opinion of the FDA review division is really open to speculation. And quite frankly, the advisory committee members will have several days to weeks to view the information that FDA has been reviewing for months and months, typically 6 to 10 months, or around that time before. So they certainly would take these things into account, but that does not necessarily mean it would tip things upside down, if you will. Now, certainly, when you talk about the scientists at FDA and the scientists in clinical practice, for example, who serve on expert committees, many of them would have trained at the same center, would have had similar scientific knowledge, And you'd expect some consistency in views because they agree on the same standards of scientific practice, whether they're at FDA, in industry, or in academia, or anywhere else in clinical practice. And typically, depending on the particular center and the review division, at about 80 to 90% of the time, FDA and the advisory committees tend to agree. So that means 10 to 20% of the time there's disagreement. And FDA may find that when the advisory committee is recommended against approval, they still feel that the basics of the standards of approval have been met, and it is FDA's responsibility, and indeed they have the accountability for that, to make that final decision. And the FDA frequently then provides an explanation of why they would or would not agree with the advisory committee's views. So that again helps with the transparency in the process.
That's really helpful. So I guess what you're saying is we shouldn't make any assumptions after May 12th, which leads me into my next question, which is what happens following an AdCom?
That's the big so what, isn't it? So what happens? And the first thing is we can count on FDA and the sponsor companies going back and rethinking about, did they make all the points they wanted to? Is there any reason for additional correspondence or exchanges? The full transcripts are usually available within about 30 days post-session. And FDA has a set period after the hearing to make their final deliberations. So there are a number of possible outcomes. FDA may go back to the sponsor with more questions. They may have felt that whatever the advisory have stimulated a need to look deeper into some of the questions raised, be they questions about safety or effectiveness or so forth. So if that occurs and additional data is requested and required, sometimes there's a reset. In other words, usually advisory committees occur about a month or so before the action date, that is FDA's predefined end of review, and it's time for the decision. But if in the last few months of the review and FDA has received additional information either upon their request or as a result of a sponsor voluntarily providing and independently providing new information, they may require more time to review that. And so the FDA would then declare what's called a major amendment, and there would be an additional period of months delay in order to allow that review, and then the action date is reset. That does not happen typically, but can happen. Or what is more typical is either there will be an approval with or without label restrictions at the time of the action date. And when that action comes, it comes not only with a label, but with a very detailed review of the whys and why nots, agreements by FDA with the sponsor proposals, or what the indication is, the population to be treated, any restrictions, any particular safety monitoring that's required. So that approval would come with or without those kind of label restrictions and potential risk management practices. With accelerated approval, there is frequently a label stipulation about the fact that definitive endpoints will be further assessed in confirmatory studies post-approval, and that needs to then confirm the surrogate endpoints, a biomarker or an intermediate clinical endpoint. Or the FDA can declare what's called a conditional approval. Either they need more time to review labeling with the sponsor to gain agreement, or that they need actually new information, new analyses, new studies, questions about inspections for manufacturing sites and so forth. So there are a number of things that come into play, and all of this is done to assure that the safety of the United States population is well protected, but also conversely, that access to important new medications and breakthroughs are not delayed. So there's a critical balance there, and this process is designed to try and reach that right counterbalancing.
That's really helpful, and I really appreciate you giving us some of your time to share all of this information. Before we close out, is there anything we missed or anything that you think is important that we touch on, or anything you want to add more details to?
Well, thanks for that opportunity, Lauren. I'm always happy to work with PPMD and the Duchenne community. This has been an important endeavor for us at Faegre Drinker, and I think we've got over 14 years experience with you, including some things that we hope have demonstrated strong collaboration between FDA and the patient community, as well as sponsors, the drug development roundtables, which bring together folks to try and talk about best practices. And I think we ought to feel comfortable that whatever the outcomes of discussions that we see, that FDA scientists, company scientists, investigators, and others all want to see new advances brought forward. And it's a matter of how do we meet the standards set forward? How do we find that balance of benefit risk? And we should present the best of intentions for all the constituents. So it's a tough process. If it was easy, anybody could do it. And after 40 years of working with FDA on more applications, I'd have to say that we should be reassured by the processes and procedures and the positively directed spirits of everybody involved. Patients are waiting. There are unmet needs. We all need to do everything possible and reasonable. And that's where the disagreements come. And we should not question the intents of folks, but sometimes we all have different set points based on our scientific and other expectations. So looking forward to a very full discussion in the upcoming meeting and the opportunity to continue to engage with the community to help bring forward new ways to influence things. And I applaud PPMD's leadership of the update of the guidance document submitted to FDA for Duchenne, which includes a section on gene therapy. And I would commend to others the reading there because it represents the best thinking of science. Really care about moving these innovations forward. So thanks very much for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Tim. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Take care. We'll see you May 12th.